The air in the Blue Ridge Mountains of Virginia carried a specific chill that morning. A damp, biting cold that seemed to seep through the wooden slats of the small, isolated cabin Lyria called home. For most, the beauty of the sunrise was a visual feast of oranges and deep purples over the jagged peaks. But for Lyria, the morning was a symphony of textures and subtle shifts in temperature. She stood by the window, her fingers tracing the rough grain of the windowsill. She could feel the sun's first rays as a gentle, prickling warmth on her pale skin, a stark contrast to the frost still clinging to the glass. To her, the world was not a picture, but a living, breathing entity composed of the smell of wet earth, the distant rush of the river, and the heavy, suffocating scent of anxiety that had been radiating from her family for days. Today was the day of the Great Mating, a ritual as old as the mountains themselves. In this society, structured by the rigid laws of alphas, betas, and omegas, status was everything. And Lyria, born with eyes that saw only a milky, perpetual fog, was seen as the ultimate flaw. She was an omega, destined by nature to be a nurturer, a mate, and a mother. Yet her blindness was viewed as a divine mistake. She had spent 20 years in the shadows of this cabin, hidden away like a shameful secret, taught that her only value lay in her silence. The door creaked open, the rusted hinges groaning, a sound Lyria had memorized. It was her sister, Sarah. Sarah's scent was always a mix of expensive lilies and a sharp, metallic edge of resentment. Her footsteps were heavy and hurried, the sound of someone performing a chore they loathed. "Sit down, Lyria," Sarah commanded, her voice thin and brittle. "The carriage will be here in an hour. We don't have time for you to be lost in your thoughts. We have to make you look presentable, though I don't know why we bother. Mother says it's a waste of silk." Lyria sat on the edge of her narrow bed, feeling the familiar dip in the mattress. She felt Sarah's aggressive movements as she grabbed a brush. The bristles were stiff, catching on the tangles of Lyria's long chestnut hair. Each tug felt like a physical manifestation of her sister's anger. Sarah didn't see a sister. She saw a burden that prevented their family from ascending the social ladder of the pack. "Don't you dare look up today," Sarah hissed, leaning in close. Lyria could smell the coffee on her breath. "If you stare blankly at the elders with those dead eyes, you'll ruin everything for the rest of us. Stay quiet. Stay still. If we are lucky, some desperate scout from the lowlands might take you for a servant. It's more than you deserve, frankly." Lyria didn't respond. She had learned long ago that words were useless against the wall of their prejudice. Instead, she focused on the rhythm of her own breathing, a quiet anchor in the storm of her sister's vitriol. She felt the heavy silk of the ritual dress being pulled over her head. The fabric was cold and stiff, rubbing against her collarbones. It was a dress designed to attract an alpha's gaze, but on her, it felt like a shroud. The journey to the sacred circle was a torture of vibrations and noise. The carriage jolted over the uneven mountain roads, and as they approached the site, the air began to change. The scent of pine and fresh air was replaced by a concentrated, overwhelming miasma of pheromones. Thousands of wolves had gathered. The vibrations of their voices, the rhythmic thumping of their hearts, and the heavy predatory scent of hundreds of alphas created a sensory overload that made Lyria's head spin. She was led out of the carriage, her hand gripped tightly by her father. His hand was calloused and cold, showing no warmth, only a firm grip to ensure she didn't stumble and cause a scene. As they walked toward the center of the amphitheater, the ambient noise shifted. The boisterous laughter and shouting of the crowd began to fade, replaced by a low, buzzing hum of whispers. "Is that her? The blind one? Why did they even bring her? A waste of a ritual spot. Look at her. She can't even see the ground she walks on." The comments hit Lyria like physical stones, but she kept her face a mask of stone. She was led to the center of the great circle, a flat expanse of ancient rock that had been polished smooth by centuries of tradition. Here, the Omegas were displayed, their scents amplified by the natural acoustics of the basin, allowing the alphas to choose their matches based on biological compatibility and social standing. One by one, Lyria heard the names called. She heard the celebratory howls, the clashing of shields, and the joyous sense of successful pairings. But as the sun climbed higher, the space around her remained empty. The heat became oppressive. She could feel the sweat trickling down her back under the heavy silk. The scent of the crowd turned from curiosity to a sharp, acidic mockery. Then her name was called. Lyria of the White Peak. The silence that followed was deafening. She felt her father's hand let go of her arm, leaving her standing alone in the vast, open center of the circle. She felt exposed, a tiny island of vulnerability in a sea of predators. Her intended match, Marcus, stepped forward. She knew his scent, heavy wood smoke and the musk of a man who spent too much time trying to prove his strength. He was a high-ranking beta, someone her father had spent years trying to bribe into this union. Marcus stopped a few feet away. Lyria could hear his heavy, uneven breathing. He was angry. He felt insulted by this pairing. "I have looked upon this Omega," Marcus's voice boomed, amplified by the stone walls. There was no kindness in his tone, only a cruel, performative bravado. "And I see nothing but a broken vessel. A wolf who cannot see the moon is no wolf at all. She is a weight. She is a curse. I, Marcus of the Silver Creek, publicly reject this match. I will not tether my bloodline to a ghost." A ripple of cruel laughter erupted from the stands. It started small, but grew into a roar of mockery. Lyria stood perfectly still, her unseeing eyes fixed on the horizon she could only imagine. The rejection was expected, yet it cut deeper than she had prepared for. It wasn't just Marcus rejecting her. It was the world confirming that she had no place in it. She felt the heavy, rough hand of the Pax enforcer on her shoulder, ready to drag her toward the unclaimed gate, where she would be stripped of her name and sent to a life of grueling servitude in the Pax kitchens. 1. She felt the humiliation burning in her throat. 2. She felt the first tear escape her milky eyes, trailing a cold path down her cheek. 3. Suddenly, the world went silent. It wasn't a natural silence. It was as if a vacuum had been created, sucking the sound out of the air. The mockery, the laughter, the whispers, all of it vanished in an instant. A new scent cut through the mountain air, so powerful it made Lyria's knees tremble. It was the scent of ancient forests, of a coming thunderstorm, and a deep, metallic tang of absolute power. Heavy, deliberate footsteps echoed across the stone. They didn't sound like Marcus's hurried strides or her father's nervous shuffle. These were the steps of a king. The crowd gasped. Lyria felt the air around her grow warm, charged with a terrifying energy. The footsteps stopped directly in front of her. She could feel the heat radiating from the person standing there. "Enough," a voice said. It was low, vibrating with a frequency that seemed to shake the very stones beneath Lyria's feet. It was the voice of Caleb, the sovereign Alpha King, the man who ruled all the territories from the Atlantic to the Rockies. Lyria felt a large, warm hand reach out. With a gentleness she had never known, he cupped her chin, lifting her head. His skin was calloused, but his touch was like velvet. "You look at her and see a broken vessel?" Caleb's voice was now directed at the crowd, filled with a cold, sharp edge that made the air turn to ice. "I look at her, and I see the only soul in this valley worth my time. Marcus, you have forfeited your right to breathe the same air as her." He turned back to Lyria. She could hear his heart. It was slow, steady, like a drum in the deep. "I, Caleb, sovereign of the high throne, claim this woman," he declared. The words were a physical blow to the crowd. "She is no longer of the White Peak. She is of the crown. She is mine." Let any man who objects come forward now, so I may show him the price of his insolence." No one moved. The silence was absolute. Lyria felt her heart hammering against her ribs. She was dazed, her mind unable to process the shift from the lowest point of her life to being claimed by the most powerful man in existence. Caleb didn't wait for a response. He slid his arm around her waist, pulling her close against his side. The scent of him, ozone and cedar, enveloped her, creating a safe haven she hadn't known existed. "Come," he whispered in her ear, his breath warm against her skin. "Your life in the shadows is over, Lyria. Now, we go to the light." As he led her away, the crowd parted like the sea. Lyria walked with him, her head finally held high. Not because she could see her path, but because for the first time in 20 years, she felt someone else seeing her. But as the heavy doors of the king's black transport closed behind them, Lyria knew that the king's protection was a double-edged sword. She had been saved from the kitchens, but she had been thrust into the heart of a kingdom that would hate her for her sudden elevation. The journey had just begun, and the path ahead was fraught with more than just shadows. The transition from the rugged, organic chaos of the mountains to the high-tech, clinical luxury of King Caleb's estate in the heart of New York was a shock to Lyria's system. The transport was silent, moving with a smoothness that felt unnatural. Inside, the air was filtered and temperature-controlled, smelling of nothing but leather and the king's overwhelming presence. Caleb didn't speak during the flight. Lyria sat tucked into the corner of the plush seat, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She was acutely aware of him, the way he shifted his weight, the sound of his fingers tapping a rhythmic pattern on his knee, the intense heat radiating from his body. He was a predator, the apex of their kind, and she was a girl who had spent her life being told she was prey. When they finally arrived, the sounds of the city hit Lyria like a physical wall. The roar of engines, the distant sirens, the hum of millions of lives. It was a cacophony that threatened to drown out her senses. But then, she was led into the estate. The Glass Fortress, as people called it, was a masterpiece of modern architecture. To Lyria, it was a world of echoing marble, smooth glass panels, and long, straight hallways. Caleb led her through the house, his hand never leaving the small of her back. "This is your home now," he said, his voice echoing in the vast foyer. "You will have your own suite. My staff has been instructed to assist you, but I expect you to learn the layout. I do not want you to feel like a prisoner here." "I have always been a prisoner, Your Majesty," Lyria said, her voice trembling slightly. It was the first time she had spoken since the ritual. Caleb stopped walking. She felt him turn toward her. The air pressure changed as he leaned in. "Here, you are a queen. Do not call me Your Majesty when we are alone. My name is Caleb." He called for Martha, the head housekeeper. Martha's scent was complicated: lavender, old books, and a thick layer of skepticism. "Show her the East Wing," Caleb commanded. "Ensure she has everything. And Martha. If I hear of a single person treating her with anything less than absolute devotion, they will answer to me." As Martha led Lyria away, the girl felt the weight of the king's gaze on her back until she turned the corner. The suite was more than a room. It was a sanctuary. Martha showed her the tactile markers that had been placed on the walls, small, elegant carvings that indicated which room was which. The bed was massive, covered in silk that felt like water against her skin. There was a balcony that overlooked the city, the air there tasting of rain and distant ocean salt. But the luxury couldn't hide the tension. Over the next few days, Lyria realized that the estate was a nest of vipers. She would hear the servants whispering in the kitchens when they thought she was out of earshot. "A blind Omega," one would hiss. "He's lost his mind. The council is already calling for an emergency session. She can't even pour her own tea." How is she supposed to stand beside him at the gala? Lyria didn't let them see that she heard. Instead, she spent her nights mapping the house. She counted steps. 112 from her bedroom to the library. 54 to the dining hall. She memorized the scent of the different woods used in the furniture. Mahogany in the study, oak in the halls. She learned the sound of the air vents, the way the hum of the city changed depending on which window she was near. She also learned about Caleb. He was a man of discipline. He rose at dawn, his scent of cedar and cold air filling the hallways as he went to his private gym. He spent his days in meetings, his voice often rising in frustration as he dealt with the rebellious alphas of the southern packs. One evening, unable to sleep, Lyria wandered into the library. It was a massive room, smelling of leather-bound books and vanilla. She felt her way along the shelves, her fingers grazing the spines. "They are in Braille," a voice said from the shadows. Lyria jumped, her heart racing. "Caleb, I didn't know you were here." "I come here to think," he said. She heard the clink of ice in a glass. "My grandfather had a sister who lost her sight in a skirmish. He had the library adapted for her. I thought you might appreciate it." Lyria moved toward the sound of his voice. "Why did you really claim me, Caleb? It wasn't just to spite Marcus. An alpha king doesn't take a mate out of pity." Caleb sighed, a sound of deep weariness. "You're right. It wasn't pity. Your father. He didn't realize what he had in you. There is an old bloodline, Lyria. One that was thought to be extinct. A line of Omegas who didn't see with their eyes, but with their spirits. They were the true heart of the packs. They could sense a lie before it was spoken, and a betrayal before it was planned." He stood up, and she felt him approach. "When I saw you in that circle, I didn't see a blind girl. I saw a power that our kind has forgotten, and I saw someone who looked at the world with more courage than any warrior I've ever commanded." He reached out and took her hand, his thumb tracing the palm of her hand. "The council thinks I've brought a weakness into this house. I want you to prove them wrong. Not for me, but for yourself." The intimacy of the moment was broken by the sharp ringing of a phone. Caleb's scent immediately shifted to one of intense aggression. He answered, his voice turning to ice. "What do you mean the border has been breached? Where is the security detail?" He hung up and turned to Lyria. "Stay in your room. Lock the door. We are under attack." The glass fortress was no longer a sanctuary. It was a target, and Lyria, despite her training, felt the old coldness of fear returning. But this time, she wasn't just a girl in a cabin. She was the king's mate, and she realized that if she wanted to survive, she would have to use the very flaw that her family had hated her for. She stood in the dark library listening. She didn't need the lights. She could hear the muffled thuds of tactical boots on the roof. She could smell the acrid scent of smoke bombs. And she could hear the rapid, fluttering heartbeat of a traitor inside the house. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the unfolding of this story of overcoming, and leave a comment about which part of Lyria's strength has impressed you the most so far. The darkness of the glass fortress was absolute, but for Lyria, it was merely the stage where she had always performed. While the elite guards scrambled for night vision goggles and the backup generators struggled to kick in, Lyria stood in the center of the library, her breathing shallow and controlled. The air was thick with the scent of ozone and the acrid tang of military-grade smoke. Above, the rhythmic thud of helicopter blades vibrated through the reinforced glass, a sound that would have terrified any other Omega. But Lyria didn't just hear the noise. She felt the displacement of the air, the way the sound waves bounced off the mahogany shelves. "Elena," Lyria whispered, her voice barely a thread. She knew the head of security was nearby. She could smell the woman's scent, gun oil and dried peppermint. "My queen, stay down." Elena's voice came from the shadows, tight with adrenaline. They've bypassed the perimeter. We have a breach on the 3rd floor. I need to get you to the panic room." "No," Lyria said, her hand reaching out to find the edge of a desk. "There are 3 men in the ventilation shaft above the master suite. I can hear the metallic click of their gear. And there's someone else. Someone who belongs here. Their heartbeat is too fast, a frantic, stuttering rhythm of guilt." Elena paused. To her, the house was a chaotic mess of alarms and shouting. But she had learned to trust Lyria's ears. "Who, Lyria?" "The gardener's assistant, Thomas. He isn't in the garden. He's in the server room. I can hear the hum of the cooling fans changing as he opens the main terminal." Guided by Lyria's uncanny perception, Elena dispatched a team. Within minutes, the internal threat was neutralized, and the tactical team in the vents was intercepted before they could reach the king's private quarters. However, the external attack was far from over. Caleb arrived in the library moments later, his presence like a tidal wave of heat and protective fury. He was in his half-shifted state, his eyes glowing like embers in the dark, his claws extended. He didn't say a word. He simply pulled Lyria into his chest, his heart beating a frantic rhythm against her ear. "They were looking for you," he growled, his voice vibrating in his throat. "Sterling's men. They thought that by taking you, they could break me. They don't realize you are the only reason I'm still holding back." The suffering that followed that night was not physical, but psychological. The estate became a high-security prison. Caleb, consumed by the need to protect his mate and maintain his grip on the splintering council, grew distant. He spent hours in war rooms, his scent turning bitter with the stress of a looming civil war. Lyria, meanwhile, was confined to the upper floors. The whispers of the staff grew louder, more venomous. They blamed her for the king's distraction, for the instability of the kingdom. One evening, Julian, Caleb's younger brother, visited her. His scent was always pleasant, sandalwood and expensive silk. But today, there was an underlying note of something Lyria couldn't quite identify. "He's losing the support of the Western Pax, Lyria," Julian said softly as they sat on the balcony. The city below was a sea of white noise. "They see him as a king ruled by a weakness. They don't see your strength. They only see a girl who can't lead a hunt. If you love him, you should consider what's best for the crown." "And what is that, Julian?" Lyria asked, her sightless eyes turned toward the wind. "Go back to the mountains. Let him marry Alpha Sterling's daughter. It's the only way to prevent a massacre." Lyria felt a coldness in her gut that had nothing to do with the night air. Julian wasn't just offering advice. He was planting seeds of doubt. But Lyria didn't feel like a weakness. She felt like a weapon that hadn't been drawn yet. She began to realize that the blind girl was the perfect spy. No one noticed her in the corners of the rooms. No one filtered their words when she was near, assuming she was lost in her own dark world. She started to document everything. The subtle shifts in the advisor's tones, the secret meetings in the hallways, the smell of treason that clung to Julian's expensive suits. She realized that the attack on the estate hadn't been a failed coup. It had been a distraction to hide a much larger theft, the codes to the kingdom's financial reserves. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the unfolding of this story of resilience, and leave a comment about which part of Lyria's strength has impressed you the most so far. The Winter Gala was meant to be a show of strength, a defiant declaration that King Caleb was in absolute control. The grand ballroom of the Pierre Hotel was transformed into a glittering palace of ice and silver. The scent of the event was a dizzying mix of gardenias, expensive champagne, and the underlying tension of hundreds of apex predators forced into a single room. Lyria felt the weight of the emerald velvet dress, a garment so heavy and ornate it felt like armor. Caleb held her hand with a grip that was almost bruising, his dominant aura radiating from him in waves. "Stay close to me," he whispered, his voice a low vibration. "The council is looking for any sign of hesitation." As they moved through the crowd, Lyria felt the prickle of 1,000 eyes. She heard the sneers masked as coughs. But she focused on the sounds she needed. She heard the clink of a specific ring against a crystal glass. A signal. She heard the rustle of a parchment being exchanged in a dark corner. Then came the moment of the toast. Caleb was handed a glass of deep red wine. Lyria, standing beside him, suddenly felt a sharp, metallic scent, something hidden beneath the rich aroma of the grapes. It was the Mountain Widow, the same poison Martha had been forced to use, but this time it was concentrated. It wasn't meant to numb. It was meant to paralyze a wolf's heart within minutes. "Caleb, don't," Lyria said, her voice cutting through the expectant silence of the room. The king paused, the glass inches from his lips. The room went still. Alpha Sterling, standing across from them, had a heartbeat that suddenly accelerated to a frantic pace. "What is it, Lyria?" Caleb asked, his eyes narrowing. "The wine," she said, turning her head toward Sterling. "It smells of the widow's vine and the bitter almonds of betrayal. And it was poured by someone who is wearing the scent of Alpha Sterling's private study." The accusation was a thunderclap. Sterling laughed, a dry, brittle sound. "The blind girl is hallucinating. She's overwhelmed by the lights she can't see." "I don't need to see the lights to hear the tremor in your voice, Sterling." Lyria stepped forward, her confidence a tangible thing. "I don't need to see your face to smell the sweat of a man who knows he's about to lose everything. You didn't just try to poison the king. You've been selling our territory's secrets to the Northern Coalition. I heard you talking to Julian in the library 3 nights ago. You thought I was asleep, but I was counting the lies in every breath you took." Julian, standing behind Caleb, turned pale. The betrayal was deep, a wound in the very center of the royal family. Caleb didn't hesitate. He smashed the glass on the floor, the red wine staining the white marble like a pool of blood. "Seize them!" Caleb roared. The ballroom erupted into chaos. Wolves shifted, growls filled the air, and the elegant gala turned into a battlefield. In the confusion, Julian and Sterling managed to fight their way to the exits, aided by a small group of loyalists. They fled into the night, but the damage was done. The king had been saved by the woman the world had called a defect. However, the victory felt hollow. Caleb was devastated by his brother's betrayal. The suffering deepened as the kingdom descended into a state of emergency. The glass fortress was no longer a home, it was a command center. "I have to go after them," Caleb told Lyria that night. He was packing his gear, his movements robotic. "If I don't end this now, the packs will tear each other apart." "I'm going with you," Lyria said, her voice leaving no room for argument. "It's too dangerous, Lyria. We're going into the mountains, into the heart of their territory." "You are going into a storm, Caleb," she said, walking toward him and placing her hands on his chest. "In the mountains, in the fog, in the dark, your eyes will fail you. Your technology will fail you. But I have never lived in anything but the dark. I am the only one who can lead you through the devil's throat." Caleb looked at her, really looked at her, and for the first time, he saw not just his mate, but his equal. The Appalachian Mountains were a jagged, unforgiving spine of stone and ice. As the royal helicopters struggled against the buffeting winds of a late-season blizzard, Lyria sat in the jump seat, her eyes closed, her mind projected outward. She wasn't looking for lights. She was listening for the mountain's breath. "The wind is screaming through the East Pass," she told the pilot over the headset. "If we fly there, the turbulence will take us down. We need to drop low, into the canyon floor. The air is stiller there, heavy with the scent of pine." They landed in a clearing a mile from Sterling's hidden fortress. The snow was waist-deep in places, and the temperature was low enough to freeze a wolf's breath. Caleb and his elite guard moved with tactical precision, but even they were struggling with the zero visibility conditions. "Lyria, lead us," Caleb commanded. She took the lead, her fingers tracing the frozen bark of the trees, her ears tuned to the distant drip of water in the limestone caves. She moved with a grace that seemed supernatural, bypassing traps that Sterling's men had laid in the snow, tripwires that she could hear singing in the wind. As they reached the entrance of the Devil's Throat, a narrow canyon that served as Sterling's last stand, Lyria stopped. "They're above us," she whispered. "On the ridges. They have high-caliber rifles. They're waiting for us to enter the bottleneck." Caleb gestured for his men to take cover. "How many?" 14 on the left, 12 on the right. I can hear the click of their safeties being disengaged. The battle that followed was a nightmare of sound and fury. Caleb shifted, his massive black wolf form a blur of violence in the snow. Lyria stayed low, tucked behind a boulder, but she wasn't passive. She was the eyes and ears of the king. "Caleb, to your 6 o'clock, the one with the scent of wood smoke. He has a grenade." "Elena, the sniper on the ridge is repositioning. Listen for the slide of his boots on the ice." Guided by her voice, the Royal Guard dismantled Sterling's defenses. But in the final push toward the bunker, a massive explosion rocked the canyon. Sterling had detonated a series of charges, causing a massive avalanche. Lyria felt the world tilt. The roar of the falling snow was deafening, a wall of white death coming down from the heights. She was swept off her feet, her body battered against the rocks as she was buried under a crushing weight of ice and stone. Silence followed. Lyria woke up in a small pocket of air beneath the snow. Her leg was pinned, a agonizing heat radiating from her ankle. She could smell the metallic tang of her own blood. But more importantly, she could hear the rhythmic ticking of a secondary charge, a dead man's switch Sterling had planted to take down anyone who survived the avalanche. She began to dig. Her fingers were numb, her nails bleeding as she clawed at the packed snow and gravel. She had to find the wire. She had to find the heart of the machine. Caleb. She called out through their bond, her mind a flare of desperation. "Caleb, I'm here. Don't come for me yet. There's a bomb. I need to find it." She felt his response, a wave of agonized love and a refusal to stay away. "I'm coming, Lyria. Hold on." She found the metal casing of the detonator. It was buried deep in the rubble. Her fingers explored the surface, finding the 3 wires. She couldn't see their colors, but she could feel the vibrations. One wire was silent. One was vibrating with a high-frequency hum. The third was warm, pulsing like a heartbeat. She remembered what Caleb had told her about the ancient Omegas. They saw with their spirits. She closed her eyes and let her consciousness sink into the wire. She felt the flow of electrons, the countdown of the timer. She pulled the warm wire. The ticking stopped. A moment later, the snow above her was cleared away by massive, powerful paws. Caleb, in his wolf form, dug her out with a frantic energy, his whimpers of relief echoing in the canyon. He shifted back to human form and pulled her into his arms, his tears warm against her frozen skin. "You did it," he whispered, his voice broken. "You saved us all again." "I didn't do it to save the kingdom, Caleb," she coughed, the mountain air burning her lungs. "I did it because I'm not finished being your queen." The war ended not with a slaughter, but with a transformation. Sterling was captured, and Julian was sent into exile, stripped of his titles and his wolf. The glass fortress was rebuilt, but this time it was designed differently. There were more windows, more gardens, and the markers Lyria had used were integrated into the architecture of every pack house in the country. The final scene took place 6 months later. The Blue Ridge Mountains were lush and green, the scent of wildflowers filling the air. Lyria stood at the edge of the sacred circle, the very place where she had been abandoned and rejected. But today, The circle was filled with thousands of wolves from every pack, all standing in a respectful, awestruck silence. Caleb stood beside her, wearing his royal robes, but his hand was tucked firmly into hers. "Today," Caleb's voice boomed across the valley, "we do not mate by ritual or by law. We mate by choice. And we recognize that the strength of a wolf is not measured by the sharpness of their eyes, but by the clarity of their heart." He turned to Lyria. He took a silver circlet, fashioned like a crown of thorns and roses, and placed it on her head. "Lyria, the High Queen," he announced. The roar of the crowd was like a physical wave of love. Lyria felt the vibrations in her chest, a resonance that made her feel more connected to her people than she ever thought possible. She stepped forward, her sightless eyes turned toward the crowd. "I spent 20 years believing I was a mistake," she said, her voice carrying through the natural acoustics of the mountains. "I spent my life in a silence I thought was my only home. But the king didn't give me sight. He gave me a voice. And I promised to use that voice to ensure that no Omega, no wolf, and no soul is ever discarded because they see the world differently." As the sun set behind the peaks, painting a world Lyria could only feel as a deep, soul-warming glow, she leaned into Caleb. "What do you see now?" he whispered. "I see a world where the shadows have finally turned into light," she replied. They walked back toward the palace, together, two souls who had found their way through the dark to build a future that was, for the first time, truly bright for everyone. This was our journey. Did you enjoy the ending for Lyria and King Caleb? Leave a comment sharing your favorite part of the story, and don't forget to subscribe for more emotional stories just like this one.